My mom called me on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before I even answered that something had shifted in our family in a way that couldn't be undone. I was standing in the parking lot of the hospital where I work, still in my scrubs, a lukewarm coffee in my hand, and 12 hours of night shift behind me. The Georgia sun was already bright and warm for early October, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could look so ordinary when everything was about to change. A sparrow landed on the hood of the car next to mine and sat there for a moment, perfectly still, and then it was gone. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "Claire," she said, and her voice was different, not sad, not broken. It was something else, something I hadn't heard before, and I'd known that voice my whole life. "Your grandmother passed last night, peaceful, in her sleep. The nurse said she just let go." I sat down on the curb. I didn't care that my scrubs were clean or that people were walking past me toward the entrance. I sat down and I pressed my palm flat against the warm asphalt, and I breathed. My grandmother, Ruth Eleanor Halston, was 83 years old. She had survived a first husband who left her with 3 kids and no savings, built a cleaning business from the ground up with a mop and a truck she bought secondhand, paid off a house in Savannah while raising my mother and her 2 brothers alone, and then, when she was 61, bought a second property on Tybee Island that she turned into a vacation rental. Then a third. Over 20 years, quietly and without fanfare, she had built something. 7 properties across coastal Georgia, all of them hers. All of them earned with her own 2 hands and her own stubborn refusal to accept that the life she had been handed was the life she had to keep. She had told me once, when I was maybe 16, and spending the summer helping her clean the rentals between tenants, that she never trusted anyone to take care of her, except herself. "That's not sad, baby," she'd said, wringing out a mop with both hands, not even looking up. "That's just smart." I had thought about that a lot over the years, more than she probably knew. I pressed my phone to my ear and asked my mother when the services would be. "Saturday," she said. "We're handling everything. You just come home." I didn't ask who he was. I told her I'd be there by Friday evening, and I hung up and sat there on that curb for another few minutes, letting the grief find its shape inside my chest. It came in slow, the way grief does when you have loved someone for a long time and their absence hasn't made itself real yet. I drove home, called in to let the charge nurse know I had a family emergency, and fell asleep in my clothes. I grew up in Brunswick, Georgia, about an hour from Savannah. My parents still lived in the house I grew up in, a 3-bedroom ranch on a street lined with live oaks that dropped their leaves in winter in a half-hearted way, as if they couldn't quite commit to the season. My mother, Diane, had worked at the same insurance company for 20 years. Same desk, same coffee mug, same parking spot. My father, Glenn, had retired from the county public works department and spent his days puttering in a garden that he was deeply proud of and mildly bad at. They were comfortable people, predictable people, people who clipped coupons and argued about the thermostat and went to the same church they'd attended since before I was born. My grandmother had never quite fit in with their kind of comfortable. She was too sharp, too self-sufficient, too independent in ways that seemed to quietly unsettle my mother. Ruth had opinions, and she gave them freely. She kept her own books, made her own decisions, chose her own contractors, negotiated her own leases, and she did not ask permission from anyone. She had earned that right through decades of doing everything herself, and she wore it not as arrogance, but as simple fact. I had always admired her for exactly that. From the time I was small, she had seemed to me like a different category of person entirely. Someone who existed on her own terms, in a way that most people only talked about. I had also noticed, over the years, that my mother sometimes spoke about her with a thinly veiled impatience. Not cruelty. Nothing you could point to directly. Just a sort of low-grade resentment that surfaced in small ways. In comments about how Ruth never asked for help. In complaints that she never shared her finances with the family. In muttered observations at holiday dinners that she was difficult. That she always had to do things her own way, that nobody ever knew what she was thinking. What my mother called difficult, I called disciplined. But I had learned not to say that out loud. My Uncle Dennis, my mother's older brother, was cut from similar cloth to my mother, though louder about it. He was a large man with strong opinions and a habit of assuming that his presence in a room constituted a contribution to whatever was happening in it. He had managed one of Grandma Ruth's properties for a few years in his 40s, handled the maintenance calls, collected rent, deposited it into an account she kept tabs on. He had done it with the expectation, I think, that it was the beginning of something larger, that she would see how capable he was and eventually hand things over, that the work was a kind of audition for inheritance. She hadn't seen it that way. She had thanked him for his time and quietly resumed managing everything herself when he moved to Augusta for his wife's job. Dennis had not said much about it at the time, but I had noticed that after that point, his comments about Ruth at family gatherings took on a different texture, less affectionate, more assessing. My Uncle Pete, the youngest, lived in Florida and barely called. He had borrowed money from Ruth twice and repaid it once, and she had lent it both times without comment, which I think he had mistaken for softness. Pete was not a bad man. He was simply the kind of man who moved through life expecting things to work out and occasionally needing other people to help make that happen. I was Ruth's only grandchild. She had told me when I turned 30 that she had a plan for the properties, that she had spoken to a lawyer, that everything was written down clearly and properly and that I didn't need to worry about anything. She had said it the way she said most important things, plainly and without decoration, looking directly at me over a cup of coffee at her kitchen table in Savannah. "I don't want things to get messy when I'm gone," she had said. "I've seen what happens to families when there's nothing in writing. I've seen good people turn into strangers over a dining room set. I'm not going to let that happen." I had nodded and not asked questions. It felt too close to asking about death, and she was still sharp and moving and so entirely present in the world that it had seemed unnecessary, even indelicate, to press for details. I trusted her. That was enough, I thought. I understood, later, why she had tried to tell me. She had been giving me a landmark, something to find my way back to when the time came. I arrived in Brunswick on Friday evening, as I'd promised. My parents' house smelled like casserole and cut flowers and the particular humidity of October in coastal Georgia, that soft dampness that never fully leaves the air even when the heat breaks. My mother hugged me at the door, and I could feel the stiffness in her shoulders, something held tight and deliberate, a tension that didn't match the softness of grief. My father patted my back and told me I looked tired, which was his way of saying he was glad I came and didn't know how else to say it. Uncle Dennis was in the living room with his wife, Carol. They were seated close together on the couch, which I noticed only because Dennis wasn't the kind of man who sat close to his wife in other people's living rooms. There was something conspiratorial about their posture, a closeness that felt less like comfort and more like alignment, like two people who had already talked through something and arrived at a shared position. I registered it as odd and then filed it away somewhere in the back of my mind. We ate dinner and talked about Ruth. The stories were good ones, honest ones. Even Dennis laughed when my mother told the story about Grandma showing up at a contractor's job site in her good shoes because he had overcharged her by $400, and she had the receipts in her purse to prove exactly where every penny had gone. She had stood on that job site and walked him through every line item until he wrote her a check right there. She hadn't needed anyone to fight her battles. She had fought them herself, methodically and without drama, and she had always won. I went to bed that night feeling the grief like a weight on my sternum, pressing down gently and steadily the way grief does when it is real, and there is nothing to do with it except carry it forward. Saturday was the service. The church was half full with people who had known Ruth over the decades, tenants who had become friends over years of small repairs and prompt deposits and fair treatment, women from her congregation who had sat beside her in the same pew every Sunday for 30 years, neighbors who had watched her carry groceries and mow her own lawn well into her 70s, the woman who had done her hair every 6 weeks since 1991, people who had actually been in her life, not in her finances. In her life. I sat in the front pew between my parents and I held my mother's hand when she cried, and the crying seemed real, and I thought I had maybe imagined the stiffness the night before. Grief does strange things to people. It makes them hold their bodies differently. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, sitting there in that pew, because she was my mother, and I loved her, and Ruth was gone. After the burial, we went back to my parents' house. There was food everywhere, the way there always is after Southern funerals, as if casseroles are the agreed-upon language of condolence. There was conversation and sweet tea, and the particular exhaustion of grief shared with a crowd, that bone-tiredness that comes from holding yourself together in public for hours. Dennis pulled my father aside at one point, and they stood near the back hallway talking in low voices with their backs angled away from the room. Carol refilled the sweet tea and smiled at everyone who looked her way with the practiced warmth of someone playing a long game. I didn't think much of it that afternoon. I was tired and sad and full of casserole, and I wanted to sleep. It was the next morning, Sunday, over coffee, with the October light coming pale and thin through the kitchen window, that my mother sat down across from me at the table and folded her hands and said, "There are some things we need to talk about regarding your grandmother's estate." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "Okay, we've been in contact with a lawyer," she said, and her voice was measured, careful, the voice she used when she had prepared what she was going to say ahead of time. "Dennis and Pete and your father and we've decided that the most logical arrangement, given everything, is for the four of us to manage the properties collectively as co-inheritors." I waited. She didn't say anything else. "Mom," I said, slowly, "what about Grandma's will?" My mother's expression didn't change in the way that expressions change when the question is unexpected. It changed in the way that expressions change when the question has been anticipated and the answer has been rehearsed. "We haven't been able to locate a formal will," she said. "We've looked through her papers thoroughly." "She told me she had one," I said. She was specific about it. She told me she had worked with a lawyer, and that everything was properly documented. "Well," my mother unfolded and refolded her hands on the table. A small, precise gesture. "Without a document, the estate defaults to her children under Georgia intestate law. Dennis, Pete, and I are her surviving children. Your father has been helping us coordinate the process." I looked at my father. He was looking at his coffee with the concentrated attention of a man examining something very interesting in his mug. "She had a will," I said again, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, not from uncertainty, but from the effort of staying calm. She told me directly, at her kitchen table, that she had spoken to a lawyer and that everything was in writing. My mother's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Claire, I understand this is hard. We're all grieving. But the practical reality is that there is no document that we've been able to find, and we need to move forward in a way that makes sense for everyone." Something cold moved through me then. Not just grief. Something harder and more clarifying. The kind of cold that comes when you understand suddenly what you are actually looking at. "What about the lawyer she worked with?" I asked. "Do you have any idea who that was?" "We're not sure." "You're not sure?" I repeated. She didn't share those details with us. I set down my mug carefully, with both hands, the way you set down something you don't want to spill. I thought about what Ruth had said to me. I thought about the way she had said it, directly and without any softness around the edges. I've seen what happens to families when there's nothing in writing. And I thought about the fact that she had been specific, deliberate, looking right at me, telling me that there was something in writing. I thought about the stiffness in my mother's shoulders Friday evening, the way it hadn't felt like grief. I told my mother I needed some air, and I walked out to the back porch and stood there among the live oaks, their Spanish moss moving slightly in the morning breeze, and the October light fell through the branches in long, pale shafts, and I made a decision. I was going to find that will. I spent Sunday afternoon at the hotel where I had moved my things that morning, methodically calling every law office in Savannah with an estate planning practice. I explained the situation each time, calmly and precisely. My grandmother had passed. I believed she had worked with an attorney on estate planning. I was trying to locate the documentation. Some assistants were polite and unhelpful. Some took my number and didn't call back. One, at a small firm on Drayton Street near Forsyth Park, put me on hold for 3 minutes and came back to say that yes, Ruth Eleanor Halston had been a client, that yes, there was a document on file, and that they would need to speak with me in person before sharing any details. I drove to Savannah on Monday morning with my hands steady on the wheel. The law office was on the second floor of a narrow building, the kind of old Savannah building with heart pine floors and tall windows that let in the light in long rectangular panels. The attorney was a woman named Sandra Okafor, mid-50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had sat across from grieving and frightened and angry people many times and knew exactly what she was doing in every case. She shook my hand and offered me water and sat down and opened a folder on the desk in front of her. "Your grandmother came to us 4 years ago," she said. She was thorough and clear-minded, and she knew exactly what she wanted. We drafted her will, had it witnessed and notarized by 2 independent witnesses, and we have been holding the original document in our secure files since the day she signed it. "My mother's family is claiming no will exists," I said. "That no document has been found." Sandra Okafor looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression that was not surprise. "Your grandmother's will designates you, Claire Marie Halston, as the sole beneficiary of her estate, including all 7 properties and the associated rental income accounts. She also left a letter of instruction alongside the will, explaining her reasoning and her specific wishes for how the properties should be managed going forward." I sat with that for a moment. The afternoon light came through the tall windows and lay across the floor in long, pale rectangles. "My mother and my uncles don't know this," I said. "Your grandmother chose not to share the specifics of her estate plan with them during her lifetime," Sandra said. "That was entirely her right. The document is valid, properly executed, and witnessed. I can file it with the Chatham County Probate Court this week." I drove back toward Brunswick with the copy of the will in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, and I thought about my grandmother standing in a vacation rental with a mop, telling a 16-year-old girl that taking care of yourself wasn't sad, it was smart. She had known. She had known this was exactly what would happen, and she had prepared for it 4 years in advance, and she had tried to tell me where to look. I didn't go to my parents' house that night. I checked into a hotel and I called my closest friend Maya, and I told her everything. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Claire, they were going to let you get nothing. Your own mother?" "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let the process work," I said. "That's what Grandma set up. I'm going to trust it." I called Sandra Okafor the next morning and told her to file it. The notice of probate proceedings arrived at my parents' address within the week. I know this because my mother called me that afternoon, and this time, the careful, measured voice was entirely gone. "How dare you go behind our backs," she said, and the words came fast and sharp. "We are her children. We are the ones who were here. You moved to Atlanta and built your career and came home twice a year at Christmas, and now you want to take everything she spent her life building?" "I'm not taking anything," I said. "She gave it to me. She made that decision 4 years ago with a clear mind and a licensed attorney and 2 witnesses. We don't know that that document is legitimate." I took a slow breath. "It was drafted by a licensed attorney, witnessed, notarized, and has been in her firm's secure files for 4 years. The same firm that Ruth chose, contacted, and paid directly. Dennis says we have grounds to contest." "That's between you and a judge," I said quietly. "I hope you'll think carefully before you go that route, Mom. For everyone's sake." She hung up. She did not think carefully. Dennis retained an attorney within the week. The grounds for contest were undue influence, the claim that I had manipulated Ruth into writing me into the will and excluding her own children and lack of testamentary capacity, the suggestion that Ruth had not been mentally competent when the document was executed. I read the filing and sat with the particular kind of hurt that comes not from being attacked by strangers, but from being attacked by people who know exactly who you are and choose to lie about it anyway. My grandmother had been one of the sharpest people I had ever known. She had managed 7 properties, negotiated every lease, balanced every set of books, made every decision without assistance into the last year of her life. The suggestion that she had been incompetent was not just legally unfounded, it was a specific, deliberate insult to everything she had been and everything she had spent 83 years building. I retained my own attorney, a man named Robert Tate out of Savannah who specialized in estate litigation. Robert was calm and precise and moved with the efficient confidence of someone who had litigated these cases many times and understood exactly what each side would argue and how to counter it. He obtained Ruth's full medical records going back 5 years. He lined up her primary care physician as a potential witness. He contacted Sandra Okafor, who had her own contemporaneous notes on Ruth's mental state at the time of signing. He reached out to both witnesses to the will, both still living, both willing to testify. Undue influence is notoriously difficult to prove, Robert told me in our first meeting, his hands folded on the desk, direct and unhurried, especially when the decedent was, by every account in her life, a woman who was influenced by no one and nothing except her own judgment. She told me once that she never trusted anyone to take care of her except herself, I said. Robert looked at me. Write that down exactly as you just said it. The months that followed were long and grinding in the way that legal proceedings are long and grinding, not dramatic, mostly, but steady and wearing, full of paperwork and phone calls and drives between Atlanta and Savannah and the constant low hum of something unresolved. I took calls from Robert at odd hours. I went through Ruth's papers and her bank records and her email correspondence, building a picture of a woman who had been, at every documented point in her life, entirely in command of herself and her decisions. I spoke to tenants. Several of them wrote statements voluntarily, without being asked, because they had known Ruth and they were angry at what was being claimed about her. One tenant, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Fontaine, who had rented a cottage on Tybee Island from Ruth for 11 years, sent a 4-page handwritten letter to Robert's office. In it, she wrote about Ruth's precision, her memory, her consistency, the way she had handled every conversation with total clarity. She wrote that Ruth had remembered every lease term, known every repair history, and had never once in 11 years seemed anything other than fully present and fully herself. I read that letter 3 times and cried each time. My mother called me 3 more times during those months. The first call was accusatory, the same notes as before. The second was a softer appeal. Couldn't we settle this quietly? Couldn't I see how this was pulling the family apart? Didn't I understand what I was doing to everyone? The third call came late on a Wednesday night, and her voice was different again, quieter than it had been in months, and she said, "Claire, I just don't understand why she didn't tell us, why she kept it from us. We're her children." And for a moment I almost said what I actually thought, which was that Ruth had kept it from them precisely because she had known this was what would happen, that she had been protecting her own wishes from the people most likely to argue against them. Maybe, I said carefully, she knew that if she told you, it would just start this fight earlier. Silence on the line. "I have to go, Mom," I said. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of March in the Chatham County Probate Court in Savannah. I drove down the night before and had dinner alone at a quiet restaurant near the waterfront, a place with small tables and good lighting and the sound of the river somewhere close. I walked along the river in the dark afterward. Savannah in March is starting to come alive again, azaleas pushing color into the squares, the air carrying magnolia and river water, and the particular softness of the southern coast in early spring. I thought about my grandmother, about every summer I had spent with her, learning without knowing I was learning. She had taught me to read a lease and spot a bad clause. She had taught me to keep a separate ledger for every property and reconcile it monthly. She had taught me how to talk to a contractor so they knew you understood what the job required and couldn't be taken advantage of. She had done all of this without making it feel like instruction. It had felt like conversation, like company, like being trusted with something real. I thought about the letter. Sandra had given it to me sealed, in a cream-colored envelope with my name on the front in Ruth's firm cursive, the day I came to the office. I had opened it alone in my car in the parking garage, and I had sat there for a long time after I finished reading it. She had written 3 pages. She had written about why she had chosen me, not simply because I was her granddaughter, but because she had watched me over decades, and she had seen something specific. She wrote that the properties were not just assets, not just income. They were 7 families' homes, 7 sets of people who paid affordable rent because she had made a deliberate choice, year after year, not to maximize what she could extract from them. She had kept the rents below market because she believed that housing was not just a commodity and that a landlord had a responsibility to the people who trusted her with their shelter. She wanted someone who understood that and would keep it. She wrote, "Your mother is a good woman and I love her with my whole heart. But she sees these houses as money. You see them as people. That is the difference. And it is not a small one. She also wrote, "I know this may cause pain in the family. I am sorry for that, more than I can say. But I have watched you, Claire, and I know who you are, and I believe in you completely. I always have. From the time you were small. I had memorized it. I brought it to court anyway." The courtroom was small and formal, the kind of room that smells like old wood and institutional paper, and the accumulated weight of decisions made in it over decades. My mother and Dennis sat at the table across the aisle. My mother wore a dark blazer and her silver earrings, the ones she wore to church and to things that mattered. She did not look at me when I came in. Dennis looked at me once and then looked at the wall above my head. Carol sat in the gallery behind them, her hands folded in her lap. My father was not there. He had told me privately, the week before, in a phone call that he had clearly made from somewhere my mother couldn't hear, that he didn't agree with what they were doing, but he didn't know how to stop it, and he was sorry. I told him I understood, and I think I meant it. And I think he knew that what he was sorry for was more than just this. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Greer, and she had the manner of someone who had presided over every version of this kind of proceeding and found none of it surprising. She moved efficiently and read carefully, and when she asked questions they were precise and she did not ask them twice. Dennis's attorney presented first. The undue influence argument centered on the closeness of my relationship with Ruth, the time I had spent with her, the fact that I had been her primary confidant in her later years. The implication was that proximity itself was suspicious. Judge Greer looked up from her notepad. "Counsel, are you arguing that the closeness of a relationship between a grandmother and her granddaughter constitutes evidence of improper influence?" The attorney recalibrated and moved to the larger argument. The exclusion of Ruth's own children from the inheritance was irregular and suggested the will did not represent her true wishes. Judge Greer set her pen down with a small, deliberate click. "A competent adult has the absolute legal right to leave her estate to whomever she chooses," she said, "including non-family members, including strangers. The question before this court is not whether this disposition was expected or felt fair by the family. The question is whether the document was validly executed by a person of sound testamentary capacity. Are we in agreement on that fundamental point?" Dennis's attorney said, "Yes, Your Honor." Ruth's physician testified by written declaration that she had been in full cognitive health at the time of signing and had remained so until the physical decline of her final months. Both witnesses testified in person. Sandra Okafor testified about her direct interaction with Ruth on the day of signing, her notes from that meeting, and her professional assessment of Ruth's state of mind. Robert presented the letter of instruction and asked that it be entered into the record. Judge Greer read it in full. She read slowly and without expression, and the courtroom was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. "I have read a considerable number of letters left alongside estate documents," she said. "This is among the clearest and most deliberate statements of intent and reasoning I have encountered. This woman understood what she owned, understood what she wanted done with it, and understood exactly why. There is no ambiguity here." She looked at Dennis's attorney. "The petition to contest is denied. The will of Ruth Eleanor Halston stands as executed. The estate is to be distributed in accordance with its terms." My mother made a sound. Not a word. Something that came from a place below words. I looked at the grain of the wooden table in front of me. I breathed slowly. Robert touched my arm and said quietly, "That's it, Claire," and I nodded. In the hallway outside, I sat on a bench in the pale March light that came through the tall courthouse windows. The sound of the street came up from below, ordinary and unhurried. My hands were folded in my lap and they were steady, and I was slightly surprised by that. My mother came out a few minutes after me. She walked toward the elevator and then stopped. She stood with her back to me for a moment, and I watched her shoulders, the familiar line of them, the shoulders I had leaned against as a child. And I waited. When she turned, her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure is costing something. "I want you to know," she said, that I don't believe your grandmother was right to do this. I know you don't, I said. She had children. She had family who were here. She had the right to decide what happened to what she built, I said. She built every one of those properties herself. Not us. Her. That was always hers to decide. Something moved across my mother's face then. Something I couldn't fully name. It might have been the first edge of understanding. It might have been something else entirely. I don't know how we come back from this, she said. I don't know either, I said honestly, but I'd like to try. When you're ready, if you ever are. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she walked to the elevator and the doors closed behind her. Dennis did not speak to me at all. In the weeks after, I began the process of transferring the properties into my name, methodically and with Robert's guidance and Sandra's documentation and the deep, grounding sense that I was doing exactly what Ruth had intended. I wrote to each tenant personally. I told them the properties had changed ownership, that their leases would be honored without exception, that nothing about their situation would change. I told them I intended to continue what Ruth had built, and I meant it. Mrs. Fontaine called me. 81 years old, voice warm and deliberate, calling from Tybee Island to say that Ruth had talked about me, that she had said I was the one who understood. I believed her when she said it, Mrs. Fontaine told me. I still do. I took a week off in April and drove to every property. I met tenants at each one. I walked through every unit and introduced myself and said in person what I had said in writing. A contractor who had worked for Ruth for 16 years shook my hand with both of his and said, "She always told me, when the time comes, you'll know her. She said you'd be the right one." A couple who had rented a small house in the Savannah Historic District for 9 years brought out coffee and sat with me on their front steps for an hour just talking about her. I am still a nurse. I didn't leave my career or relocate. I hired a property manager named Keisha, organized and careful and serious about the work, and we talk every week. The properties are running well. I think about Ruth every time I look at the numbers. The rents she held steady, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And I hold that line. My father calls occasionally. He asks about the properties in the cautious way of someone who wants to know but isn't sure he has the right to ask. I tell him what I can. He is doing what he is able to do, which is limited, and I have made a kind of peace with that. My mother called on my birthday in June. Her voice was softer than it had been in months, and she asked about the tenants, and I told her a little about Mrs. Fontaine, and about the couple on the front steps, and there was a pause, and then my mother said, "She always did know people, better than anyone I ever met." "She did," I said. We stayed on the phone a few minutes more. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not fully. It was not reconciliation, but it was a door left open, just slightly, and I think we both understood what it meant to leave it that way. There is a morning I keep returning to in my mind. I was at the Tybee Island property, the first one Ruth ever bought, the one that started everything. Checking in after a tenant turnover, the unit clean and bright, windows open to the salt air. The Atlantic was visible over the dunes, wide and silver in the morning light. I stood in the small kitchen where I had stood so many summers ago with a mop and a bucket and a grandmother who was teaching me without calling it teaching, and I stayed there for a long time. She had seen me. Out of everyone, she had looked at me and seen specifically me, and she had made a decision and held to it quietly for 4 years, and she had been right. I think about the weight of that, the particular weight of being known truly by someone and trusted completely. Not as a burden, as a foundation. She told me once that taking care of yourself wasn't sad. It was smart. She was right about that. She was right about most things. I lock up the cottage and walk out into the salt air, and the water is bright and wide and the dunes are covered in sea oats moving in the breeze. And I think that wherever she is, she knows how this turned out. I think she always did.